Hello my dear friends, how's it going? I'm Mari Thuriger and today I'm here to talk about legalism in ancient Greek culture, an important religious manifestation that has changed forever after the panorama of politics and religion, not only in the ancient classical world, but to this day in societies, nations and countries where there isn't a proper separation of church and state, where religion has a great weight on political decisions and vice versa. Before we start, let me just ask you if you have enjoyed the introduction to this video. It was a few years back, 5 years ago as of this video to be more precise, with my old camera, as you can see, on a very intense recreation of a Greco-Roman celebration to Dionysus or Bacchus, full of surprises and absolute madness. What a night! Well, I intend to use that introduction on future videos because I have half a mind to start doing a series on classical history. So according to your feedback, of course, and your wants and needs, let me know if you would like such series. This doesn't mean I will abandon Scandinavian studies. It just means I'll do more stuff and extend into other cultural backgrounds. More anxiety, stress, sleepless nights. Lovely. Now, let's move forward to the subject of this video. If you would be so kind, please. In the past, I've made a video about the Greek religious mysteries, where I've talked about the Eleusinian mysteries, a religious performance which, to a certain extent, had its own restrictions and part of it reserved to its elite members, but the processions and certain religious acts and manifestations were publicly displayed. I've also talked about the Dionysian cult in that same video, which starts off as something more under the parameters of a shamanic performance, quite brutal, eventually becoming quite popular. In fact, the popularity of such a cult was mostly based on the desire of the masses to have mystic and ecstatic experiences, which took on extraordinary proportions. And of course, such a popular religion among the masses was taking away the power of the elites, especially of the religious performances that aimed to control the masses. Therefore, all the Dionysiac frenzy was tamed by both the joint forces of the state and the Delphic Oracle, eventually turning the Dionysian cult into something far more mythical and controlled, and little more than a safe reenactment for the masses. And then, of course, I've also talked about Orphism on that same video, one of the most popular and widespread religious mysticisms of classical antiquity. All these religious manifestations towards the divine and the supernatural have one thing in common. They were mystical currents, mysticisms. Now, I'm not using the term mysticism as a synonymous for the absurd, the superstitious, pseudoscience, as something opposed to enlightenment and rationality, as it came to be known in Abrahamic religious discourse. No, not at all. Mysticism as religious currents that aim to create a human approach towards the divine and the supernatural through mystic and ecstatic forms, aiming to achieve transcendence beyond the mundane affairs of the mortal world, with a much more emotional, subjective character. All the aforementioned mysticisms were completely opposed to legalism, which was therefore an effort to gain the favor of the gods by fulfilling their precepts, or in other words, seeking to make peace with the divine and gain something beneficial and win its favor by fulfilling its commandments. The first and more concrete expression of legalism appears in the didactic poem Works and Days, written by the Greek poet Hesiod around 700 before the Common Era. We have an interesting example there. For instance, Hesiod advises the farmer that before putting his hand to the plow, he prays, or he must pray to Chthonian Zeus, therefore Hades, and to Demeter, so that his field may produce in abundance. In search of favor of the gods, through prayer, through a religious conduct that aims to complete the necessary and official rites of the cult by properly addressing the divine as it has been intended by the divine, as it has been dictated by the official legislation and the religious organisms that control a particular cult, and also through purification. That also includes going, or rather, includes doing the stipulated rites, sacrifices, the pouring out of libations and offerings in the morning when one rises and in the evening when one retires. In other words, piety, devotion towards the gods. Ritualism is what we are talking about here, which is only another name for legalism, and which is much more prominent in Hesiod, precisely. Instead of a mystical and ecstatic way to seek out the divine, legalism focuses instead on the official rites, on the ritualization of pragmatic behaviors. Therefore, a stipulated action that becomes canon, controlling the spiritual. And this changes the autonomy of the individual. This prevents individual imagination and creativity, as well as diminishing and eventually averting personalization of belief systems and the way people individually communicate with the divine according to their own abilities. So, indeed, quite different from the mystical currents spoken previously. There's a clear attempt, and a successful one in the long run, of controlling spirituality, binding the masses to the state and how the elites conduct religious acts. Therefore, this leads us to speak of the Oracle of Delphi, which has been somewhat romanticized by neo-paganism and other New Age religious movements as something quite mystical, which actually has its own mystical content, of course, obviously, but nevertheless, it became a strong tool of the state, and it played an active role in the politics and in the control of the masses, directing them towards what the state wants, often disguised as being a divine will. What I mean is that too often it is quite romanticized, the figure of the Pythia, the high priestess of the temple of Apollo at Delphi, as being the mouth through which Apollo speaks, but quite romanticized the idea that she was the sole figure in power, independent, quite romanticized by the same late 19th century movements that have given us quite the historically distorted figure of the egalitarian witch. The Pythia was a tool of the state. Well then, the maximum representative of legalism is Apollo, of course, who makes known his sentences through the Oracle of Delphi. He exerts an incalculable influence on the Greek world, and the whole of Greek literature from the Iliad to the last pagan authors bears abundant testimony to this. It was this god who prescribed the purifications to be carried out for homicides, and approved the constitutions of new cities, advised kings or heads of state in case of war, and recognized new deities and cults. It was in many ways the center of Greek life, and along its sacred way, literally the physical path, lined up the treasures with which the various cities honored the god in commemoration of victories. Thus, speaking of the treasury building as well, of course, the Doric monument. Also, after the Battle of Plataea, a golden tripod was enshrined in Delphi, on which the names of the 31 Greek cities that fought against the Persian invader were inscribed. His influence reached even beyond the borders of the Hellenic world. Now, be it truth or fantasy, a story like that of King Croesus of Lydia, told by Herodotus, simultaneously illustrates the importance of this cult in a barbaric country and the famous ambiguity of the oracles. Croesus sent an inquiry to Delphi if he should undertake a campaign against the Persians. Pythia, the oracle, replied that if he did, he would put an end to a great empire. The king attacks and he is defeated, and already taken prisoner by Cyrus, he manages to send questions to Apollo if this is how he treats his devotees, to which the god objects that he should have asked a second oracle before going on campaign to know what empire he was going to put an end to. So we see quite the ambiguity of the oracle in here. Bacchylides, the third ode, in turn also testifies to the richness of the offerings made to the sanctuary by this monarch, whose name has become a symbol of extreme wealth. Just a side note. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi has existed since circa 750 before the Common Era, and has since had a pan-Hellenic character, therefore important throughout the Hellenic cultural world. Although I must say that some authors, of course, are divided on the hypothesis that Delphi was already a cult center in Mycenaean times, and whether or not this practice continued during the Dark Age of the classical world. Well, it is thought, though lately also doubted, that the first stone temple was erected in the 7th century before the Common Era, destroyed by a fire in 598, 597, and then replaced by the one the Achaemenids had built. This in turn was brought down by an earthquake in 373 before the Common Era, rebuilt in that same century, and what remains today is from that period precisely. The excavations, the archaeological excavations at the site, show the difficulty of reconciling traditional data according to which there was a geographical crack or fault or a chasm through which exhalations or gas came out, and an innermost sanctuary, a shrine where one could not penetrate, a source of water channeled there, whose water the Pythia drank. Well, indeed, not only did archaeologists not find the crack or the chasm, but geologists declared that the terrain could not have had it. Therefore, it seems that we are not facing a geological fault, but a human-made opening in the ground. Combining archaeological data with literary data, it is concluded then that the space of the interior of the sanctuary was a simple opening on the temple's slab at the bottom of the central nave, thus communicating with an underground cavity, which was the sanctuary itself, literally. And the source of water was partly discovered. In fact, part of the plumbing system that reveals its route was discovered, and the most accepted hypothesis is that the architects of the 4th century before the Common Era diverted it, as the stagnation of the waters transformed the layer of schist on which the temple rests in slippery mud. But this diversion was made in such a way that apparently the vein continued to pass through the building and flowed on the opposite side into a bowl. Inside were several relics, one of which was the laurel tree of Apollo, the only tree that was inside a temple. Close to it and the prophetic tripod was the omphalos, the conical stone that the Greeks said to mark the center of the world, which was certainly religious and with a moral sense of it for the Greeks and the mentality of the period of the time, as a geographic marker, indicating the place as having a great religious importance, the center of religion, being the very center of the world for the Greeks, or the center of the Greek world for the Greeks, which today we think may have been a divine stone worshipped by the ancestors of the Greeks, and the tradition somewhat carried on. Of course, next to the temple was the tomb of Neoptolemus, son of Achilles and conqueror of Troy, and a little above another stone on which, according to Pausanias, pure olive oil was poured every day. According to Hesiod, the stone that Kronos swallowed, supposing it to be his youngest son, and that later on he had to vomit obliged by Zeus, and the supreme god himself later on placed it in Delphi for mortals to admire. The origin of this stone is thought to be a meteorite, which as an object coming from the sky, well, would easily be considered sacred, obviously. At the entrance of the sanctuary, for the benefit of thirsty visitors these days, the Castilian spring is still running, formerly used to clean the temple, and whose archaic part was only discovered in 1959. Details, which some of you are certainly not interested in, and I understand, it's completely understandable. However, as an archaeologist myself, I can tell you that it is precisely through this type of discoveries and studies that we have a better perception of how things worked, how the buildings were, and how they were distributed, and thus better understand the human experience in these spaces, these religious spaces. Well, if the validity of the tradition in comparison with the results of the excavations, the archaeological excavations, has been discussed so many times and put to question, much more has been the literary and epigraphic data, both those concerning the functioning of the oracle and the Pythian answers themselves. The literary tradition has been called into question many times. There are many doubts, and there are very good and comprehensive studies that really show us great inconsistencies, many inconsistencies when compared to other sources of study, of course. And the entire literary tradition about the oracles has been put to question, except that of Plutarch from the 1st to the 2nd century of the Common Era, who was a priest in that sanctuary of Apollo. He catalogues the responses, more than 600, dividing them into stories, quasi-stories, legendary, and fictional stories. Of course, in the tradition of Greek tragedy, many take place in the sanctuary, and it is rare to find one that makes no reference to oracles. We are facing exaggerated stagings and with a lot of fiction, but not all oracles in verse were invented, mind you. Otherwise, I think there was no reason why the same Plutarch could put this curious phrase into the mouth of a figure in one of his Delphic dialogues, and I quote, if you please. "And yet the god is the chief of the muses, and should care no less for the so-called elegance of expression than for the beauty of the rhythm and musicality of the song, and for exceeding far in the excellence of his poetry, be that of Hesiod or Homer." However, what we see is that most of the oracles overflow with errors of meter and style and are full of banalities. From this and from other testimonies, it can be inferred, I think, that at least the foundation of this tradition must have been authentic. Much discussed is also the mode of operation of the oracle. The same Plutarch speaks of the offering of a sacrifice, the crowning of the victim or sprinkling with lustral water, the observation of its movements by the priests to deduce whether the god was present or not. Apparently, the consultants approached in the order designated by luck or perhaps fate, and the sacred cake, palunos, bread or loaf, and cattle were offered in order to be authorized to consult the god himself. Of course, one of the most complex issues is the possession of the Pythia. Combining the various descriptions, we can get some insight, but very unclear. Actually, there are more assumptions than anything concrete. Ablutions, perhaps at the Castilian spring, perhaps drinking water from some holy spring, contact with the god through the sacred tree at the temple, or holding a laurel branch as in a well-known Greek cup from the 5th century before the Common Era in the Berlin Museum, or fumigating with burnt laurel leaves, as Plutarch refers actually, or chewing them, as Lucian says. And then sitting on the tripod, thus creating yet another contact with the god by occupying his ritual place. Being seated on somewhat a high seat, a high position of ritual, kind of reminds me of the prophetesses of late Iron Age and medieval period of Scandinavia, from whom there's also little concrete and there's more suppositions than actual concrete evidences of the performances. But in some occasions, actually, in a late Iron Age Scandinavia, there's mention of specific figures, usually people in positions of power, in prominent positions, usually men, chieftains or kings, who incorporate a particular deity for divination or prophetic purposes. So there's this curious pattern here. Let's not stray from the subject. The same authors also mentioned that the Pythia therefore entered a trance which was induced by autosuggestion, like the medium mystic trance of today. The Pythia's delirium is defined as enthusiasmus, or divine possession, psychologically an alienation, and as such, unlike some authors have stated actually, she therefore did not utter inarticulate screams, but rather spoke coherently and clearly, a type of embodiment of divinity. And that idea of the Pythia's inspiration coming from vapors, from gas, from the chasm, as was once supposed, is hypothesized to be clearly a Hellenistic invention. In fact, the only literary source that can be accepted as being more truthful or as close to the truth as possible is precisely that of Plutarch, who mentions 4 factors that affect the Pythia and induce the enthusiasmus, under the action of which the oracle utters the answers. Pneumata, breaths, dynamis, potencies, arithmeses, fumigations, and atmoi, vapors. He also mentions that the prophetess has 2 distinct emotions, inspiration and nature, her nature, in addition to recognizing that the Pythia herself is not always in the same state of mind. Many disturbances take hold of her body and pass into her soul. It is necessary, he tells us, of course, that she has to have the temperament and condition that allows her to bear inspiration with impunity. As for the oracles themselves and their claimed ambiguity, this is considered to be a modern notion by some authors. However, here again we find ourselves in contradiction with Plutarch, who mentions precisely that obscurity was once considered dignified and was necessary, given the nature of the consultations and that there was a certain ambiguity, circumlocution, lack of clarity. Also, he says that the tyrants were thus left in ignorance and the enemies were not warned. For them, they cast a veil of illusions and ambiguities that hid the meaning to the others, but did not deceive the intelligence of the consultants themselves, who gave all their attention to the answers. So there is a very intelligent game in here, I would say, in order to prevent the right information from falling into the wrong hands. Or, in other words, this ambiguity allows information to be protected so that enemies and tyrants remain in doubt and do not use the information to their favor and to the disfavor of others whom the Oracle at Delphi intends to protect and benefit from. Now, in terms of the answers, whether these were directly given by the Pythia or not is another questionable point. But Plutarch says that there were professional versifiers installed around the oracle to choose the answers, a fact also mentioned by Strabo and by no other author. The same Plutarch mentions the existence of prophets or priests and consecrated men, hosii, holy ones, who helped the former in ritual ceremonies. We have to take into account that in these aspects about priests and the hosii, we have other sources that tell us exactly the same thing, and we are talking about sources that between them have a time span of about 7 centuries. So at least this aspect from these people around the Pythia, We cannot speak of variations through time or inventions or whatnot, but it does seem to have been a stable practice, right? And I think there is a rather curious episode regarding the power of the oracles and how they were revered and feared in the Hellenic world. Because, well, let's see, during the Greco-Persian Wars, Herodotus comments on what the oracle proclaimed through her state of trance. And if you please, I'll quote again. Not even the fearful oracles coming from Delphi, who instilled terror, persuaded them to abandon Greece, but remained to deter the invader and to meet him. Hence, it is remarkable that in spite of a clear answer from the oracle, the Greeks did not obey and stood firm and were victorious over the Persians, and yet the oracle was not discredited. This is actually a very interesting social phenomenon concerning the Greek society at the time, a culture of guilt and instability where you had to find safety somewhere. Well, taking into account that there were no sacred books, no clergy, it was the representative of Zeus, Apollo, who filled this gap, since he was an omniscient advisor. The Greeks believed in his oracle, not because they were superstitious fools, but because they could not do without believing in him. This need for belief was a very important pillar in the structure of Greek societies at the time, which demonstrates the social and psychological importance of the existence of oracles and the god Apollo, the cult of Apollo itself. And another aspect of the question that also deserves to be considered, as I said, literary references to the oracles were numerous. But among these, it is worth highlighting those that prove the great importance attributed to it by the great philosophers, namely Socrates and Plato. These sources would suffice to give us a measure of Delphi's place and importance in the Greek mind and society, consequently. I won't talk about such sources here, I leave that for you to explore. I think anyone who knows Socrates and Plato is well aware of the importance attributed to the oracle. So, my dear friends, this is where we end today's video. I was actually thinking about carrying on with the gods and heroes and eventually the great festivals as also themes or subjects that are part of the ancient Hellenic religiosity, but we shall leave it for another video, of course, depending on your feedback and if indeed this is proving to be useful and entertaining. Well, thank you so much for watching, see you on the next video, and as always, thank you for today. Until we meet again, my dear friends.